All right, in this video, I'm going to read the following article, What the Media Won't Tell You, Jim Jones was a CIA operative conducting mind control experiments. This, of course, is referring to the Jonestown Massacre. And before getting started, I want to stress that this is a hypothesis that the author is speculating on here. Don't take what I read as gospel, as something that is proven. No, you would need to look into this on your own and double check a lot of things that are stated here. You don't just run with something like this. That being said, disclaimers aside, I think this is very useful to keep in the back of your mind, at least the possibility of something like this having transpired, as it relates to what is going on the internet. Just in a more refined, less obvious way. And the only reason it's less obvious, at least at first, is you're staring at a screen at the presentation that someone else is giving you, and you're not seeing the rest of their life. You're only seeing this little bit of who they present themselves to be. And that makes it a little more difficult to gauge who some of these people really are. But knowing that this kind of operation behind the scenes is possible will help to inform you about what is going on now. On November 18th, 1978, 913 people died in Jonestown, a small compound carved out of the jungles of Guyana, a small country on the northeast coast of South America. The media at the time reported that it was a fanatical group of followers of the Reverend Jim Jones led to the jungles of South America to get away from the oppression of life here in America. They also reported that his followers willingly followed their leader into the great beyond by sipping on some cyanide cocktails laced with purple Kool-Aid. In fact, the notion of a mass suicide at Jonestown has been repeated so many times that it is accepted as fact, and the association is so strong that when most people hear Jonestown, the first thing which pops in their head is Kool-Aid. And of course, all of us have heard the phrase, "don't drink the Kool-Aid," and that is referring to this event and the way that it was portrayed by the media. As it says here, that association was made so strongly and so clearly over and over again that we just came to associate the event as "don't drink the Kool-Aid." This association is false. The source of the Kool-Aid suicide stories was the U.S. State Department, which presented the story immediately after the suicides, quote-unquote, were reported as though it was the only obvious truth. A U.S. Army spokesman pronounced with complete authority, "No autopsies are needed. The cause of death is not an issue here." The bodies were then allowed to rot in the jungle. Despite the lack of need for autopsies, Dr. C. Leslie Mutu, the top Guyanese pathologist, was at Jonestown hours after the deaths, and, refusing the assistance of U.S. pathologists, accompanied the teams that examined the bodies. His conclusions: Dr. Mutu found fresh needle marks at the back of the left shoulder blades on 80 to 90% of the victims. This is what I was referring to as something that would need to be vetted. You would have to go into the documents that exist on this and the various interviews that exist on this and make sure that this pathologist actually said this. That's the kind of thing that you want to fact check, okay? And not just take as a fact, because that's a bold claim, right? Oh, there was actually all of these fresh needle marks on the bodies, which would obviously completely dispel anything that we've been told about how these people really died. Others had been shot or strangled. A surviving witness stated that those who resisted were forced by armed guards to comply. Dr. Mutu's opinion and that of the Guyanese grand jury investigating Jonestown was that all but 3, only 2 of which were suicides, were murdered by persons unknown. And let me be clear before going forward, I'm not trying to say that the person writing this isn't credible. That's just what you should be doing for anything that you read or anything that you find on the internet that is contradicting something that is so conventionally known and accepted. Because, as I've gone into in prior videos, there is intentional, pre-calculated disinformation put on the internet in so many ways and in so many different places. So this process that I'm referring to here is to keep you from falling into repeating that kind of information, okay? The suicide hoax is merely the beginning of the deception. The original death count was 408, an odd number to use if the number was an estimate, with the added claim that 700 had fled into the jungle. The final total was changed to 913. To explain this rather minor difference in arithmetic, American authorities first explained that those backward, ignorant Guyanese could not count. Perhaps because the official explanation of the bad math was so insulting, it was then proposed that they missed a pile of bodies, as if a pile of dead bodies is something that is easily overlooked. Finally, the official explanation that settled the whole question was presented. Bodies were stacked on top of each other. Of the 150 photos taken of the massacre, not one shows any body lying under any others. Those who first worked on the bodies to release the gases of decay had to puncture the dead, making it unlikely that they missed anyone. These facts aside, one must wonder how 408 bodies, 82 belonging to children, could cover 505 others. Talk about bad math. With minor exceptions, pictures show the dead were found in neat rows face down. The pictures also show drag marks leading to the bodies, indicating that victims were murdered elsewhere and placed there by someone else. These facts have led to a more likely conclusion. Now here, this is speculation, remember. 408 was indeed the correct original body count. The other 505 were hunted down and slaughtered, then dragged back. But who would do such a thing and why? Furthermore, why were American officials giving such deceptive answers about Jonestown? To answer these questions, one must unravel the mystery of a man named Jim Jones. Jones became a Bible-thumping faith healer, quote-unquote, using wet chicken livers as evidence of cancer, which he removed by, quote-unquote, divine powers. That's actually a pretty good scam, using chicken livers as evidence of cancer. I had never heard that until I read this article, but that's pretty good as far as con artistry goes. But, I mean, that really shows you the power of a charismatic leader and the power that they can wield over other people, putting them under a spell. To the point where you can hold a wet chicken liver and legitimately convince someone that you took cancer out of a body. I mean, you really have to have someone under a spell for them to fall for something like that. And that's what's going on YouTube. These people have you under a spell. On all sides, the ones allegedly exposing the truth of the world and the ones allegedly exposing the exposers as not being real. It's a whole convoluted web of con artistry that's going on. The equivalent of holding a chicken liver up to your face and saying, "Look, I took cancer out of someone's body. Here's the tumor." The reality of the situation is, behind the scenes, they're all working together and planning all of this with malice aforethought. He adopted 8 children, some black, some white. Already the stench of criminal activity surrounded him, and his landlady referred to him as a gangster who used the Bible instead of a gun. Not the first and not the last of that type of gangster. Fortunately for Jones, the local police chief at the time was Dan Mitrione, a friend from childhood. Mitrione kept him from being arrested or run out of town. Mitrione would later enter the International Police Academy, a CIA front for training counterinsurgency and torture techniques. What a coincidence! The first of many, as we will see going on here. Despite having few sources for known funds, Jones found enough money to travel with his wife and family to Brazil in 1961. Coincidentally, Mitrione was there as well, having advanced quickly in the IPA. Mitrione had honed his skills at torture and assassination by practicing on kidnapped beggars. He himself was later kidnapped and murdered by guerrillas in Uruguay, an incident which became the basis of the Costa Gavras film State of Siege. Jones made regular trips to Belo Horizonte, site of CIA headquarters in Brazil, and Mitrione's town of residence. Again, what a coincidence. Apparently, this wasn't the only curious intelligence link to Jones. He told some of his neighbors that he was involved in the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. The U.S. Embassy provided Jones with transportation, groceries, and a large home. Considering his dear friendship to Mitrione and the funding of ministries, quote-unquote, in Latin America by the CIA, the theory that Jones was a U.S. intelligence asset makes quite a bit of sense. In any case, according to his neighbor, Jones lived like a rich man. Soon after the JFK assassination, Jones returned to the States with $10,000. In 1965, he formed the First People's Temple in Ukiah, California, and set up Happy Haven's Rest Home. Without trained personnel or proper licensing, Jones' camp drew in prisoners, the elderly, people from mental institutions, and 150 foster children, many of whom were transferred by court order. And it's interesting, drawing the parallel to what's going on with conspiracy theories on the internet, the way they present the information, it draws in people similarly who have a lot of issues, because those are the kinds of people who are looking for answers a lot of the time. Some kind of trauma transpires and you start looking for answers, and you're in this vulnerable state where someone can give you the alleged answer and it draws you in, and then you're hooked because they're the ones who have shown you the truth, as it were. They've enlightened you to things that you didn't know before. And you're not aware that it's rooted in deception, that there's an ulterior motive there when that is taking place. It's only later that you see that. But that's how the hook catches you initially, is you're vulnerable, coming from a place of being traumatized. And that can be manifesting itself in so many different ways. For me, how I got hooked into this is I was looking for a job in 2008 when I graduated school, and it was impossible at the time. And I'm like, what is going on here? And I started researching the economy, and that's what hooked me in. And I was hooked by all of these charlatans and grifters and con artists who have connections to the same institutions that Jim Jones did. But that's all behind the scenes, and you only find that out later when you start researching these people. But at the time, it's like, oh, they're telling me what's really going on. They're telling me what the Federal Reserve really is and what the economy really is based on. Oh, I'm getting the truth, right? They hook you in like that. But that was just my version of something traumatic going on, which is so minor on the scale of other traumas that people have that hook them in on deeper levels that are harder to come out of. Among those who contacted him, quote-unquote missionaries from World Vision, an international evangelical order that often fronts for the CIA, the local chapter head to the John Birch Society, and leaders of the Republican Party, for whom his quote-unquote church members conducted voter organization and fundraising activities for the Dick Nixon 68 campaign. Again, the John Birch Society, if you do research into it, is front and center for what is referred to now as the Truth Movement. It started with the John Birch Society. And then you can trace that into the Council for National Policy, and you can follow the threads from there all across the quote-unquote conspiracy theory truth movement. Its tentacles are everywhere in that way because, as the QAnon movement showed, they're trying to paint it as a big R organization. So the Council for National Policy is like the CFR for the right. And they organize in that way behind the scenes, and you can trace it from there. Jones' advisors included a mercenary from UNITA, the CIA-backed Angola army. Also jumping on board was the Layton family, whose patriarch, UC Berkeley chemist Dr. Lawrence Laird Layton, had worked on the Manhattan Project. Dr. Layton was also chief of the Army's Chemical Warfare Division in the early 1950s. Miss Layton was the daughter of Hugo Phillips, a German banker stockbroker who became rich representing Siemens and Halske and I.G. Farben, two notorious Nazi Holocaust profiteers. Despite his rather right-wing background, Jones suddenly declared himself a liberal socialist. In fact, he called himself a dual reincarnation of both Jesus Christ and Lenin. What a combo! At this point, a cloud of suspicion began to gather around his church, which was staffed by jackbooted armed thugs who dressed in black uniforms. Jones took everything he could from his followers, much of it in the form of welfare and social security checks, using blackmail, extortions, and other available means. The local press reported about 7 mysterious deaths of those who attempted to leave the quote-unquote church due to conflicts with Jones. Accusations of kidnapping, beatings, and sexual abuse began to circulate. To escape controversy, Jones moved to San Francisco and became an important fundraiser for the Bay Area political establishment. Soon he was schmoozing with the liberal and radical elite, meeting with, among others, Rosalind Carter and Angela Davis. Jones was rewarded by being put in charge of the City Housing Commission, and key followers were awarded jobs in the welfare department. The bulk of Jones' flock came from the unemployed and dispossessed people found there. The cult preyed on the poor and helpless, going out of its way to enlist women, children, and minorities. Many members were recruited directly from San Francisco mental hospitals. However, the move to San Francisco did little to quiet the controversy surrounding his church, and a 1977 expose put Jones on the defensive. He then moved his utopia to Guyana, aided once again by the U.S. Embassy. After receiving complaints lodged by relatives of cult members, Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown on November 18, 1978, to investigate allegations of human rights abuses. Congressman Ryan, a noted CIA critic, had authored the Hughes-Ryan Amendment, which would have required the CIA to disclose to Congress in advance details of all covert operations. Oh yeah, good luck with that, buddy. The State Department offered Ryan no answers or assistance, despite numerous inquiries. He arrived with U.S. Embassy official Richard Dwyer, as well as some journalists. Among the reporters was Tim Reederman, who had covered the Patty Hearst story for the San Francisco Examiner. In all likelihood, Ryan already suspected what was really going on at Jonestown. That was when all hell broke loose. At the airstrip, Leo Ryan soon became the first congressman to die in the line of duty, along with 4 reporters. I wonder how many of us actually know this story of Leo Ryan. It's a very underreported footnote in history now that one of our congressmen in the United States of America was murdered in a foreign country, which is just wild stuff and should be more well known, but it's not. And the reason it's not is because of what he was investigating and what he wanted to do, as we will see. The Hughes-Ryan Amendment was killed in Congress soon afterwards. The assassins were described by witnesses as glassy-eyed, mechanically walking zombies and devoid of any emotion. Dwyer and Reederman were also shot. Soon after that, the mass slaughter began. A plausible explanation for the events that unfolded is that Jim Jones or someone else ordered the murders after Ryan's unexpected visit threatened to expose what was happening. In the chaos that followed, a mass extermination was carried out. And I have to say, this is a very plausible story here using the circumstantial evidence available. This congressman made an unexpected visit to what could have possibly been a CIA front operation doing MKUltra type of experiments on the people there, and they just simply would not allow it to be exposed on the level that a congressman would have exposed it. And also, if he was allowed to expose it, then the bill that he was trying to get through the Senate that would have required the CIA to notify publicly all of their covert operations in advance would have easily passed. So you can see the motive for the murder here. This is very plausible circumstantial evidence to this theory. Now that, of course, doesn't mean it's what happened, but we're just going to keep this plausible theory in mind as we continue reading here. Just who were the zombie assassins? Well, besides the 913 dead, 167 survivors returned from the camp. I should say that then ties in what happened at the facility or his compound after they murdered the congressman. It's like, okay, burn it to the ground. We just have to get rid of this whole thing. Let's clean it all up. All news reports concede that there were at least 1,100 individuals at the camp, and most reports place the number at 1,200. Who are these 200 or more people unaccounted for? The survivors report that there was a special all-white group that was well-armed, well-treated, and free to exit the compound. These guards were never accounted for by any news reports. Perhaps it is these same guards, assuming the total population was 1,200, whom a congressional aide was referring to in an Associated Press quote which stated, "There are 120 white brainwashed assassins out from Jonestown awaiting the trigger word to pick up their hits." Of course, they may have had a little help. Over 300 U.S. Green Berets, trained for CIA covert assassinations, were in the area at a time. Again, what a coincidence. So were nearly 600 British Black Watch commandos who were in Guyana conducting a training exercise. Quote unquote. Suddenly, the death toll seems relatively low. The killings didn't stop in Guyana. 9 days later, San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk were slain by Dan White, who was either a disgruntled police agent or someone who was quote-unquote angry about gays. These explanations were supplied to explain his utterly irrational behavior during the killings. Sure enough, he was described as being in a bizarre quote-unquote zombie state. During White's trial, his lawyers came up with the inventive but deservedly mocked Twinkie defense, quote-unquote, in which they claimed he went insane during a sugar high induced by eating too many sweets. Moscone and Milk received substantial financial backing from Jim Jones during his stay by the Bay. Afterwards, they were both investigated in connection to missing funds from the People's Temple. That is, until a quote-unquote lone gunman took them out. And of course, you'll all remember that a few years ago, Sean Penn, who has interesting connections in these respects as far as what his activities are overseas, played Harvey Milk, and they portrayed his murder or quote-unquote assassination in a much different way. Michael Prokes, a Jones aide, held a press conference and stated that the CIA and FBI were withholding an audio tape of the massacre. He also stated that he was an FBI informant. Right after that, he went to the restroom and never left. His death was proclaimed a quote-unquote suicide. What a coincidence! This witness who potentially had an audio tape of the massacre ends up dead as well. In Georgetown, several more Temple members were killed following the Guyana massacre. The man charged with the murders, Charles Beekman, was an early follower of Jones who had become an adopted son. Beekman was also a Green Beret. Jeanne and Al Mills, who were writing a book on Jonestown, were bound and shot to death at their home. In Detroit, another survivor was killed near his home, and yet another was involved in a mass murder of school children in Los Angeles. Ironically, the dead may not have included Jim Jones himself. The body alleged to be his didn't show his tattoos in the photographs. Fingerprints had to be checked twice, and his dental records were never looked at. He was known to use doubles. As the massacre unfolded, Jones can be heard on a tape recording yelling, "Get Dwyer out of here." Richard Dwyer was later found at the airstrip methodically washing his hands. In 1968, Dwyer was listed in the publication Who's Who in the CIA. When asked if the allegation was true, he replied, quote unquote, "No comment." So again, we're in the realm of coincidence here, noting that a very prominent CIA operative was at the compound when this all transpired. Of course, Dwyer wasn't the only link to the CIA in Guyana. Besides those previously mentioned, U.S. Ambassador John Burke and another official named Richard McCoy were both heavily involved with the intelligence community. The U.S. Embassy in Georgetown also housed the Georgetown CIA station. At the time, Guyana had a socialist government and thus was a likely target for covert operations. Dan Weber, sent to Guyana after the massacre, was also with the CIA. The official attorney for the survivors, Joseph Blatchford, was involved in a scandal involving CIA infiltration of the Peace Corps. Then we have the missing money that just disappeared after the slaughter. Conservative estimates place the amount at $26 million. Others place it at $2 billion. At the time, a major international money laundering operation was headquartered in Italy, involving the Vatican and a fascist quasi-Masonic lodge known as the P2, or Propaganda Duo. This operation probably led to the murder of Pope John Paul I, but that's another conspiracy. The CIA-linked P2 had a major operation located in Panama, not too far from Jonestown. Add in the FBI files on the Black Panthers and weathermen found at the site, an attempt to lure Mark Lane, JFK assassination critic and James Earl Ray lawyer, among other things, and Donald Freed, Lane's sometime JFK collaborator and recent Simpson case investigator, who has linked the Brentwood murders to mafia in the LA underworld to Guyana, which succeeded in having Lane witness the airstrip murders after Jones hired him as a lawyer, and a bizarre plot to kidnap Grace Walden Stevens, a key Martin Luther King assassination witness, and smuggle her to Jonestown, and you have the makings of a full-fledged spook operation. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? One of the strangest CIA connections to Jonestown was the previously mentioned World Vision, an evangelical order which often fronts for the CIA. They performed espionage work for the CIA in Southeast Asia while Operation Phoenix, the murderous project that left 40,000 people dead, was in full effect. In Honduras, they maintained a presence at CIA-Contra recruiting camps in the war against the Sandinistas. In Lebanon, the fascist Falange butchered Palestinians at World Vision's camp. In Cuba, their refugee camps hosted numerous members of the anti-Castro terrorist group Alpha 66 of Bay of Pigs fame. After the Guyana massacre, World Vision developed a scheme to repopulate Jonestown with CIA-linked mercenaries from Laos. Laos, of course, was where the CIA was running its quote-unquote secret war during Vietnam, which for the most part was a smokescreen for a widespread opium trafficking operation. Same as it ever was, right? They did the same thing in Afghanistan with the poppy fields. One particularly important World Vision official was John Hinckley Sr., an oil man, reputed CIA officer, and friend of George Bush. You may have heard of his son. Less than 4 months before Hinckley Jr. became known as Jodie Foster's biggest fan, another member of the World Vision Order, Mark Chapman, gunned down John Lennon in what may have been a practice run for the bigger hit on President Reagan. One of the policemen who found him was convinced that he was a mind-controlled assassin. Chapman was clutching a copy of the novel Catcher in the Rye, which was also owned by John Hinckley Jr. The book was written by J.D. Salinger, who worked in military intelligence with Henry Kissinger during World War II. Before going to trial, Chapman pled guilty after a voice in his head, which he attributed to God, commanded him to do so. When the bodies were shipped back to America, there were no autopsies done. They were buried, and the families were not allowed to see them. I mean, it's just incredible what they're able to get away with. Considering the history of World Vision and what went on previously in Guyana, it is possible that the real purpose behind repopulating Jonestown was to create another breeding ground for brainwashed zombies like Chapman and Hinckley. Nearby Jonestown, there was a place called Hilltown, a compound of 8,000 blacks that followed cult leader Rabbi David Hill, who held his flock with an iron fist. Hill had so much power that he was referred to as the Vice Prime Minister of Guyana. There was also another place in Guyana called Jonestown, as well as similar operations in the Philippines and Chile. It appears that Jonestown and World Vision's later attempt is hardly the exception to the rule of using obscure locations in third world nations as laboratories for covert cult operations. The Jonestown site in Guyana was originally a Union Carbide mine and was loaded with an abundance of precious natural resources. It is very likely that the site was chosen to exploit these resources with cheap labor, and cheap labor was plentiful. Members of Jim Jones' church were bound and gagged immediately after landing in Guyana and taken to the compound. They were pumped with drugs, which were available in vast amounts at Jonestown, enough to drug 200,000 people for more than a year. Among the drugs found there, Quaaludes, Valium, morphine, Demerol, Thorazine, a dangerous tranquilizer, sodium pentothal, a truth serum, chloral hydrate, a hypnotic chemical agent, thallium, which confuses thinking, and of course, cyanide. Jonestown residents lived in cramped quarters and ate meager rations of often spoiled food. They were then forced to give 16 to 18 hours of slave labor per day. When they weren't working, they were required to stay up day and night listening to Jim Jones lecture. Among the charming punishments the flock endured were forced druggings, sensory deprivation in an underground box, physical torture, and public sexual rape and humiliation, not to mention your average ordinary beatings and verbal abuse. All of the drugs and environmental conditions forced upon Jonestown residents were also employed in the CIA's notorious MKUltra program, which was implemented to test and implement brainwashing and mind control techniques. A 1974 report admitted that certain quote-unquote target populations were used, namely blacks, women, prisoners, the elderly, children, and inmates of psychiatric wards. The Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence, using the research of Strangelovian doctors Jose Delgado and Louis Jolly West, drew guinea pigs from the target populations to test drugs, implants, and psychosurgery techniques in an isolated military missile base in California. The dead at Jonestown were 90% women, 80% black, and included 276 children. Congressman Ryan probably suspected that Jonestown was a front for sinister covert activity. In 1980, Ryan aide Joseph Holsinger received a paper entitled The Penal Colony, which explained that CIA MKUltra operations did not terminate in 1973, as officially proclaimed, but instead continued in public hospitals, prisons, and religious cults, which were used as fronts. Holsinger later stated at a San Francisco psychology forum on Jonestown that he believed the CIA worked with Jones to perform medical and mind control experiments at People's Temple. If Congressman Ryan had not been killed, a big if, many skeletons in the CIA's closet may have been exposed. Michael Myers, author of Was Jonestown a CIA Medical Experiment, had this to say. The Jonestown experiment was conceived by Dr. Layton, staffed by Dr. Layton, and financed by Dr. Layton. It was as much his project as it was Jim Jones's. Layton, remember, was head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Division. Former Temple member Joyce Shaw wondered if Jonestown was some kind of horrible government experiment or some sort of sick racist thing, a plan like that of the Germans to exterminate blacks. In October 1981, Jonestown survivors filed a $63 million lawsuit against Jonestown-era Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and CIA Director Stansfield Turner. The suit stated that the State Department and CIA conspired to enhance the economic and political powers of James Warren Jones, conducting mind control and drug experimentation there. The suit was dismissed 4 months later for failure to prosecute timely, and all requests for appeal were denied. Turner would become a director of Monsanto, now best known for providing the world with the brain-damaging, cancer-causing poison bearing the innocuous moniker NutraSweet. And this article is a little outdated in the sense that we know a lot more about Roundup and glyphosate than we did back then when this was written. In any event, yes, very interesting that CIA Director Stansfield Turner went on to be a director of Monsanto. Small world when you get up to these levels. The proverbial revolving door between government agencies and these multinational corporations. All of this, of course, is forgotten in official accounts of the events at Jonestown. Instead, the more palatable but less accurate version of the Jonestown story blames the victims, echoing the ignorant grunt uttered by Pete Hamill, who dismissed the dead as all the loose change of the 60s. Hanging over Jonestown was a mocking sign that proclaimed, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." So that's it for now. One of the main reasons that I wanted to read this is because it's becoming very popular to refer to people as cult leaders and narcissists and point to them as having these personality flaws and that being the reason for why they're doing what they're doing. And that could be the truth. There certainly are people like that in the world, and so it just is logical that you would find them in any niche of the world, whatever you're looking at. But you never want to lose sight of what's really going on here, that all of this is organized behind the scenes in advance. And the overwhelming majority of these people aren't just narcissists or con artists or grifters. No, they're there for a very specific reason, and they're being paid to do it. It's their job. And they're pushing a very specific narrative, and they're injecting you with a very specific vibration along the way to totally disconnect you from anything that is valuable that you find along the way of going down all of these rabbit holes that are largely irrelevant in the grand scheme of things as it relates to your life and who you should be. Anyways, that's it. Later.